Fitzpatrick.
Thank you for that introduction, John, and thank you everyone for coming in from what is a beautiful day outside. I'm going to start with a poem. It goes like this. It's 3:23 in the morning and I'm awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do while the planet was plundered? What did you do while the earth was unravelling? Surely you did something when the seasons started failing, when the mammals, the reptiles, the birds were all dying. Did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? What did you do once you knew? What did you do? That poem by Drew Dellinger was written and presented to Congress years ago. And I'll come back to it at the end because we all have to ask what it is that we are going to do and what we did. My talk is in 4 parts. I'll tell you a bit about my motivation, what I'm doing standing here in front of you. Then an overview of climate science. We'll take a deep dive into disinformation and come up with some strategies at the end. It starts with a love story. So this is my story. A couple of decades ago, I fell in love. I fell in love with this vast, white, indescribably beautiful continent called Antarctica. And my infatuation continues to this day. This place is what motivates me to communicate about climate change. It's an incredible place. It's ringed by the Southern Ocean. It has the harshest weather on the planet. Fewer than 1,000 people winter at about 50 different scientific stations. My love affair started like many. There was excitement, passion, possibility. And it's been lifelong. I've spent 10 summers there and a winter supporting science programs. I was sent down in a small team in my first year to find clues to past climate. So we drilled an ice core through the thickness of a glacier in Antarctica. And an ice core is like a time machine. It's unlocking the secrets of the past. From the ice that we bring up, we can actually see the bubbles of the atmosphere way back for millennia. We can see volcanic events, dust, ash. We can see sunspot cycles, and we can put together Earth's climate history. This is a pristine laboratory, and it's irreplaceable. Currently, the ice core record goes back almost 1 million years. It's 5 times as long as Homo sapiens have been on the planet. This particular ice core I'm showing you is from Dome C. It's called Epica, and it shows the CO2 record. So this is carbon dioxide. It's a tiny trace gas. There's not much of it in the Earth's atmosphere, but it traps heat really effectively. And you can see it's varied in the past. On the scale there, it varies from just under 200 parts per million to about 300 parts per million. They're the natural cycles, and they're because of a little wobble of the Earth as it goes around its orbit in the sun. The change of temperature between an ice age and a warm period is about 4 or 5 degrees global average temperature. And you can see that until the 1950s, it had really never been over 300 parts per million in that time. Now, carbon dioxide is a blanket, traps heat. We actually can't be on the planet without it. Between an ice age and a glacial, it takes about 10,000 years to get out of one. So it's quite slow. And we've done this at least 8 times in the last 1 million years. Something strange happened 200 years ago. There's this species on the planet that started digging up ancient solar energy in the form of coal, then oil, and then natural gas. We started burning it, put it into the atmosphere, and we thickened this blanket around the Earth. And what we're seeing now is that things are warming up. Now, the change that we've seen is equivalent to that change between an ice age and a warm period naturally, and it's only taken 200 years instead of that 10,000. So the rate of change is quite extraordinary. In 1988, James Hansen, a climate scientist in the United States, testified in front of the US Congress that climate change was a problem. Australia ratified the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change 4 years later. This is the same year that I started as a glaciologist with the Australian Antarctic Program. Ros Kelly was the Environment Minister at the time, and Australia was the third signatory among developed countries. I was so proud. I was convinced that Australia would be a world leader in this area and that we would forge ahead and make international agreements. And I can't tell you how wrong I was. I was young and idealistic, and I didn't know how politics worked. I had this mistaken belief that good science would lead to good policy. Over the next 30 years, I've watched this country be a pariah at the international negotiations. So as I said, I started as a glaciologist. I was actually in the building next door. And my first year there, I received this strange package in the mail, addressed to me, my name, glaciologist, Australian Antarctic Program. It was asking me to sign up to a group opposing the findings of the IPCC. So the IPCC, it's an international body set up by the World Meteorological Organization, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They use climate information that's published from all around the world and make summary reports. And I had read this report. It was very new. It had only come out in 1990. And I knew that climate change was happening. The research showed me that. All my colleagues were working on it. And yet here I was. I later found that this had been sent from the Western Fuels Association, which I'll tell you about shortly. So let's take a look at climate science. I'm sure you've heard a lot of this. I just want to reiterate where we're at with our understanding. So when I started university in the 1980s, climate science was not new. Been around for 100 years or more. And some of the famous climate scientists, or they were naturalists, they were physicists, they were mathematicians. Joseph Fourier. Now he found out that the atmosphere is an insulator. So there's this thing that's like a greenhouse. Because of its distance from the sun, the Earth should be a lot colder, but it's not. So there had to be something insulating the Earth. John Tyndall came along and said, well, I found out that molecules absorb infrared radiation. So that's just heat leaving the planet, gets absorbed. And Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish chemist, Nobel Prize winner, calculated the actual effect of that CO2 on temperature. And his back of the envelope calculation was that if we double the CO2, you get about a 4 to 6 degree warming. So he was pretty on the money. 100 years later, here we are. These are global land and ocean temperature records from the last 144 years, from just the first start of the Industrial Revolution, so late 1880s, when we'd started burning coal at a great rate. And you can see that the global average temperature is steadily increasing. In 2023, it's the highest reading in that whole record. It's about 1.4 degrees higher than it was way back in pre-industrial. And remember I mentioned it takes 4 or 5 degrees to go between an ice age and an interglacial. So 1.4 degrees is a pretty serious warming. And in fact, 2024, this year, will be the 47th year in a row that has been above the global average temperature from last century. Now, I'm not sure if there's anyone in the audience who's under 47, but anyone under 47, every young person, has never lived through an average year. We know that the 10 hottest years on record, so from that instrumental record I'm talking about, every year in the last 10 years is in the top 10. Each of the last decades is warmer than the one before. And we've just experienced the warmest 30 years since at least the middle of this millennium, back in the 600s. Now, most people think the warming is going to be slow, linear, predictable. But if you know a little bit about chemistry and physics, you'll know that the heat capacity of water is much, much greater than the heat capacity of air. So water can absorb much more heat, and that's where it's going. So the ocean warming is actually masking the true nature of what we're facing. Now, I'm a surfer and I actually really like the warmer ocean. It makes the surfing season a bit longer in Tasmania and much more pleasant. But I know that it's changing the ocean chemistry. So it changes the capacity of the ocean to uptake CO2. It changes ocean acidification, and that leads to lots of things down the line for shellfish and the food chain. It's also a bit of a time bomb waiting in the ocean when that heat gets released. We know that the cryosphere is particularly vulnerable both to a warming atmosphere and a warming ocean. We're seeing record Arctic sea ice losses. So this is the summer Arctic sea ice in millions of square kilometres over the last 40 years. And you can see that that is drastically reducing. We're seeing accelerating glacier flows, both in Greenland, the Antarctic Peninsula. We're seeing glacier meltback around the world. We also know that extreme weather events are becoming more frequent, more intense. There's a strong link between global warming and extreme weather. And now we have a whole science called attribution, where you can attribute the likelihood of an event being linked to human-caused global warming. Without the human-induced warming of the Gulf of Mexico, the two recent hurricanes, Helene and Milton, wouldn't have been quite as destructive. A warmer ocean leads to more moisture in the atmosphere, and there have been some studies that have shown they're estimating 50% of the cost of damages from these two hurricanes can be attributed to our global warming. I mentioned the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There have been 7 reports now over the time period I'm talking about. There are a lot of reasons for concern, and in the 1990 report, it was kind of like, hey, this climate change thing could be a problem. There was another report in 95, yes, it's definitely a problem. 2001, we really need to be getting on with sorting this out. 2007, it does feel like it's a broken record. 2013, we've checked, and we're not making this up, and so it really does feel like we are tapping on a microphone trying to be heard. And yet the scientific consensus is incredibly strong. So if you ask the public, do scientists think there's a link between lung cancer and smoking, overwhelmingly people would go, yeah, I think scientists believe that. But the consensus on climate change is overwhelming. 99.8% of scientists working on climate science know that there's a link. But when you ask the public, fewer than 1 in 10 people think that scientists agree. And that's because of the disinformation that I'll talk to you about. So we know the evidence is unequivocal. There are multiple lines of evidence. Dozens of national academies of sciences confirm that global warming is happening. Hundreds of institutions, thousands of scientists. After working on this for decades, it's pretty depressing. So you can imagine the toll it takes on scientists who work with this day in, day out. And in fact, Joe Duggan, who's a science communicator in Melbourne, decided to ask scientists this about 10 years ago. And he's updated that work, and he's actually gone out and asked scientists to tell him how they feel. So they feel frustrated, they feel bewildered, they feel betrayed, but they also feel determined. And I know I feel angry. And this is why I've spent a lot of my time working on disinformation, because this is what I feel the most angry about. I'm going to talk about what mis and disinformation are, why it matters, who drives it. Guess what? It's the fossil fuel industry. When they knew, what they did instead of telling the truth, who helps them spread it, and then just talk a little bit about what doesn't work to combat it and what does. So firstly, the difference between mis and dis. So many of us might have shared something with someone or on social media where we didn't mean to deceive anyone, but we find out later that it's actually not true. That's misinformation. But if the intent of whoever created the information was to deceive, then that's called disinformation. You are knowingly trying to disinform people. Now, why does it matter? It matters because it does both long-term and short-term damage. So there are three main goals of climate change disinformation. It's to deny the science, to deceive people, and to delay any action on it. And so far we've delayed climate action to the point where we're experiencing increasingly severe climate impacts. They're becoming more costly, and it's more disruptive now to do something about them. We've also got to the point where the latest IPCC report has recognised that climate misinformation is a problem. So they've said that the rhetoric and misinformation undermines the science. It's contributed to a number of misperceptions. So the first one is on consensus, which is something we're still struggling with. The second one is on uncertainty. Now, as a scientist, we're drawn to uncertainty. That's where we're actually pushing the boundaries of knowledge. We want to find things that we don't know and actually make them certain. And it completely disregards the risk and urgency of this issue. So it's been very difficult as scientists to get this message out. It does short-term harm as well. So on the left, I just put a couple of headlines that are talking about the Australian bushfires. So we know that in 2020, when those fires were going, there was a hashtag arson emergency. It was highlighted by a number of media outlets, and they misreported the bushfires, saying that the role of arsonists was the major reason that we had them, instead of these lightning strikes that were happening all across the country. And the misinformation was being spread through social media. In the middle, we've got a report showing that Sky News is actually a hub for climate misinformation. And on the right, we saw the misinformation just a month ago when these hurricanes were happening. So some of the worst misinformation ever seen. And Elon Musk actually piling on to that misinformation. So to find out who drives it, this is a schematic of some past and present funding. There are about 500 well-known front groups. We call them AstroTurf. They're fake grassroots organisations. So fake grass, AstroTurf. And they present themselves as non-partisan. They often have the same kinds of messages. And some of the names are things like the Global Climate Coalition, the Centre for the Study of Carbon Dioxide, the Science and Environment Policy Institute, the Greening Earth Society. They're think tanks that allow corporations to say things that they couldn't say themselves. They're powerful, they're relentless, and the scientific community has been up against this since the 1990s. In Australia, they have names like the Australian Climate Science Coalition. Sounds like something I might want to join. The Australian Environment Foundation, the Lavoisier Group, you might have met them in the mall. in Hobart, the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. And some of them are described as being devoted to the proposition that the basic principles of physics cease to apply when they come into conflict with the interests of the Australian coal industry. So these are all groups that have the similar messages to the ones I showed previously. When you look at funding, this is funding of those groups over a 15-year period, there are more than 49,000 grants to these companies. There are about 3,700 organisations around the world, and a lot of the funding can't be identified. But it's a very tight network of similar organisations, and they're called the Climate Change Counter Movement. The American Enterprise Institute, for example, received $380 million over this 15-year period. The Heritage Foundation, you might have heard of, $275 million. Other familiar names, the Cato Institute, the Heartland Institute. They run conferences in Australia and around the world. These are the world's largest oil companies that are behind them. And there's some smaller ones. So some of them would be very familiar as well. Woodside Energy, Santos, BHP. BP has tried to rebrand itself. So there's a term we call greenwashing. So BP used to start calling itself Beyond Petroleum. They use phrases like net zero, carbon neutral. They put forward proposals for carbon capture and storage, which is yet to be shown to be commercially viable. But they are busy greenwashing and also funding these disinformation groups. They're also funded by countries whose economies are heavily dependent on oil and gas, so petrostates. And they've been exposed for years. So you can buy books on them. And yet we don't seem to have changed what they're doing. Because it's not an information deficit problem. It's a communication issue. I first became aware of this when Ross Gelbsman published his book in 1997. I was doing a PhD when I read this book, and I took 6 months off because I wanted to actually go and have a look at what was happening. Now, Ross is an investigative journalist in Boston, and I went to Boston and worked for the Union of Concerned Scientists. It's an advocacy organisation trying to get policymakers to listen to good science, good policy. And I found out from some of the work that Ross did that at the climate negotiations, the international meetings, the fossil fuel lobbyists were given a seat at a table with the country that I came from. They were sitting down with the Australian government representatives. In his book, High and Dry, Guy Pearce exposes this greenhouse mafia. He was Guy was a former Liberal staffer who had access to a lot of information about how politics works and how our policy is reached. And so that was an eye-opening book as well. I went to a couple of the climate meetings myself, Bali and Copenhagen, and that's where I saw what was going on. It was true. Fossil fuel lobbyists had access to our government. A few years later, a couple of other books came out that were actually showing what kind of campaigns were being waged. And the fossil fuel industry was employing the same public relations companies that the tobacco industry had employed. It was the same tactics, using a loose-knit group of high-level scientists with lots of political connections, and they were running a really effective campaign to mislead the public and to deny really well-established scientific knowledge. And it's continued over decades. It's been complicit, made complicit by a media that has skewed the understanding of some of the most pressing issues. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the oil companies. So John talked about truth. So these oil companies knew the truth a long time ago. I worked for UCS for about 6 years, and I found out how early and how accurately these companies understood the harm that their products caused. So let's go back in time, 1959. That was the first year that there was a warning from scientists at the American Petroleum Institute that there might be a problem with petroleum. 1967, the Exxon subsidiary, Imperial Oil, realised that a major contributor to many of the key forms of pollution was the petroleum industry. So this is from internal memos in these companies. A 1968 internal report from Dutch oil Shell stated that air pollution was deleterious to health and that the oil industry needed to accept that cars were the greatest form of this pollution. By 1977, ExxonMobil, its Standard Oil company, was actually putting out internal reports on climate science. They had their own climate scientists doing reports for them. And by 1988, Mobil Oil addressed the greenhouse effect and acknowledged that it required a dramatic reduction in our dependence on fossil fuels. So that's the same year that James Hansen talked to Congress. So we know since the late 1970s, the early 80s, that ExxonMobil predicted global warming. Not only did they predict it, but they did it really correctly and skillfully. And when I went digging into some of the reports, they're quite astounding. So I've got 3 examples here from 1982, 1977, 2003. And these graphs show just how good their climate projections were. Over here in 1982, they've got the projection of carbon dioxide with its blue line here. So the blue line is the actual CO2 we've seen against their projection. And the red line is the observed temperature change against their projections. So they're not doing too badly. Down there on the bottom right, they've actually looked at the last glaciation. And remember I said from a glacial to an interglacial takes about 10,000 years to do. They've actually projected where that temperature will go with our projected CO2 emissions. So they have this knowledge in 1977, 1982. By 2003, they're actually using the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scenarios. So the projections of what humans might do in the next 50 years. And they've projected to the end of 2100. You can find all of these. Website Climate Files has all of their reports. And you can see just how long they've known. There are now a number of court cases being run by a group called Carbon Majors that are actually taking some of these fossil fuels companies to court over this. So you've got the historical background. Now what does disinformation look like? In the field of anti-science disinformation, there are some really tried and true tactics that we've seen again and again. I made reference to the smoking and lung cancer link. So whether you're talking about tobacco, smoking, acid rain, pesticides, climate change, the fossil fuel industry has actually hired many of the same people who disinformed the public about the harms of tobacco. And so they're using the tobacco industry's playbook. And what my colleagues at the Union of Concerned Scientists do is they've actually made a playbook, and I've altered it slightly for the Australian audience. So the first part of the playbook is hard to read there, but it's to fake the science and just looking at to conduct counterfeit science. So it's basically to make up science. So that's what all those front groups are doing. They're putting people forward as spokespeople, and they're creating they're faking the science. I'll just move on to the next one. The second one's a bit more serious. It's attacking the messenger. I know many scientists I've worked with who have been attacked for their whole careers. And it's not very nice. It can be pretty threatening to have yourself attacked, your family threatened. My first week that I started working with the Union of Concerned Scientists, I was actually told to never read the comments on anything that went out. So any blog post I wrote, any news article that I was in, any report that they released, just don't read the comments. I did once and that was enough. I know scientists in Australia, particularly female scientists, who are also being threatened, and a lot of that is becoming really misogynistic and sexist as well. The third part is to doubt the findings, so to manufacture uncertainty. And this is a classic. You don't actually have to put forward another reason for climate change not happening. You just have to introduce some doubt. Sorry. And they've been doing this really well for years. As I said, uncertainty is something that scientists are drawn to. So we like pushing the edges of human knowledge, but when you talk about uncertainty, the public, they think that climate scientists don't know what they're talking about. The next one is to cover up the truth, so buy some credibility. And the last one is actually to manipulate government officials. And that's what's happened in this country. So what does it look like? It looks like this. People saying that Earth hasn't been warming. People saying that climate change is a scam. There's a political and financial scam. It's a climate crisis that's a scam. There's no consensus. 41% of climate scientists don't believe it's happening. That there are turbines that will end up in landfill and it's not sustainable. And a lot of this online social media discussion is taking place in the echo chambers that people are in. Now this has changed over time. So in the early days, it was, it's not real, it's not us, it's not bad. So that was kind of most of the 90s, we had those kind of messages. That shifted somewhat in the 2010s. It was too expensive. So it's happening, but now it's too expensive. The solutions don't work, and China and India are not doing it, so why should we? And then later on, it was that delay became the way that you denied climate change, and that it was too late. So this is kind of the trend of these changing narratives, that it's not bad, it's not us, it's not happening. From 2000 to 2020, the actual outright denial had dropped off. Attacking the science was still there, but something new moved up to the top, and that was that the solutions don't work. And that's what we hear a lot of today. So around 2020, that's when the solutions really started being the target for disinformation. Sorry. So in 2020, what we were seeing was it's not real, it's not us, not bad, it's too expensive, the solutions don't work, but other countries aren't doing anything, it's too late. And then, since COVID, we've got a new kid on the block. And that's that now it's too woke. Okay, I didn't know what woke was when I first heard the word. Maybe you didn't either. But now it's about the elites taking over the world and creating some new world order. So that's actually the most common disinformation we're hearing around climate now. And it kind of feels like we're in this movie, everything, everywhere, all at once. We've got this climate circle of disinformation where every narrative is being highlighted. There are lots of papers you can look up. I'll put the references at the end that actually dig into these different discourses, and they show you how intricate they can get. So they're all discourses that are trying to delay what we are doing, and they become quite intricate. They range from disinformation about EV batteries. They range from front groups that are being set up in states in Australia to oppose wind turbines. So lots of different avenues. And how are they being amplified? They're being magnified by social media platforms and also by search engines. So social media is just this perfect breeding ground. And it's a perfect breeding ground because it's got three kinds of biases. So the first bias is cognitive bias, which we've all got. It's when your brain makes shortcuts between things and you fit things into a frame that you've already got. And then we have a social bias. So we're biased towards people that we know. They might be friends, they might be family, they might be people that are in a group that we're in. And so we have a tendency to trust information that comes from them. And the third one is algorithmic bias. And that's what we're being fed by the social media companies. And the way they're doing it is actually finding when people will react to something emotional. So these three biases make this a great ecosystem for both accidental and deliberate misinformation. Just to show you an example. So this is a graph showing particular narratives around climate denial that are on Twitter. It goes from 2021 to 2023. And on average for the first half of the graph, it shows you there are about 30,000 climate denial posts on Twitter every week. So each one of these is 1 week over that time. And after about July 2022, that jumps up, triples. The average after that is about 110,000 climate denial tweets a week. What happened in July 2022? Elon Musk took over Twitter. So this is the influence that one person can have on disinformation. We have our own disinformation at home in a newspaper conference room near you. So during the 2020 fires, as I said, there was disinformation around arson. It was mostly News Corp, so it was the Murdoch Press, Sky News, and research has shown that the number of climate deniers in Australia around that time was double the global average. So I used to think that Rupert Murdoch was the best export Australia ever had because he left the country, except he has an enormous influence still here. Australian news consumers are likely to believe climate change is not at all serious, twice as likely as other countries. We know that young people are more concerned though than older people. We know women are more concerned than men, and city dwellers are more concerned than rural and regional areas. But Rupert Murdoch's own son James basically disowned the paper when it was peddling climate denial during this time. The offline news source that you have, so here it runs from the Fairfax Press down through ABC, TV and radio, SBS, down to the commercial channels, then Fox News, Sky News and commercial radio. So the black is the number of people that don't think climate change is serious. So whether you think it's serious or not depends on where you get your news. All right, so I'm going to finish with some strategies. What do we do about this? So what does and doesn't work? So what doesn't work is simply countering the misinformation. We just can't match the reach that's out there. What does work is uncovering this story of who, how and why, because people love conspiracies. So you can't play whack-a-mole, not that I've ever played it myself, but countering climate disinformation piece by piece, post by post, debunking, fact-checking, no matter how hard you try, you just can't do it. I do hold hope with this though. So we live in a world where there seem to be a lot of people that like conspiracy theories, and I have a really good one for them. It's about the fossil fuel companies. So I'm wondering if this is a way to attract people to actually dig in and look into it. We do need community trust. So what we really need are simple messages used frequently by trusted messengers. Now, I am not a trusted messenger. I am part of the evil climate science empire that's trying to take over the world. But you are trusted messengers, unless you're a climate scientist. And all of us can be trusted messengers for the right audience. So think about who trusts you. your friends, your family, your colleagues. We can talk about all of those things with the people we know and build trust, because it's the trust-building conversations that are going to actually counter this. The simple message, and unfortunately we're going right back to where we were in the 90s, the simple message is that climate change is real, it's happening now, it's largely caused by the choices we make. Scientists are sure it's bad for us, and different choices can make a difference. So it's as simple as that. Plus, name who's lying and why. People don't like being lied to. So the fossil fuel industry have this really profitable model, and we need to force them to take responsibility for what they're doing to public health. Follow the money. It's easy to understand that fossil fuel companies profit from this. And big tech also profit from disinformation. So they are the enablers. So asking who's helping. So identify who it is, find out who they're being funded by, and ask who's actually helping it. There are lots of organisations working to expose fossil fuel industry. You've got the Climate Action Against Disinformation group. That's a global coalition of over 60 groups that are working on anti-disinformation. DSMOG has a climate disinformation database where you can look anyone up. And the Carbon Majors program is actually showing how they can attribute to just 78 corporate and state producing entities, over 3/4 of the global emissions that have been emitted. We know there are solutions. So the solutions exist. There are hundreds of them. They're off the shelf. We just need the hope to actually go out and use them. This is actually a rally I went to in New York City, 400,000 people, many walks of life, lots of people. And this is what gives me hope, because it's an uncoordinated group of people, millions of people around the world, and they're working to restore, protect, and repair the earth, just like the immune system does. So that's what we are. We're part of the immune system of the earth. And so I guess we have to answer the question, what is it that you'll do so that your great-great-grandchildren won't keep waking you up in your dreams? A few people I'd like to thank. Firstly, my colleagues at the Union of Concerned Scientists, the blog sites that I mentioned, and also Ross Gelbspan for writing this book. Ross died earlier this year, and I'd like to remember him as a tireless campaigner working for the exposure of climate disinformation. I have a few references you might want to look up. Just the classifying of contrarian claims. So it's a paper by Cohen et al. Looking at the foundation funding, particularly in the US, Brule has a paper out. There's a really good one that goes into the discourses of delay, so you can actually really dig into those. And then the 6 Australias, which is an expansion of some work done in the US, which is looking at what categories people fall into in Australia and where they are on that spectrum. And we know the concern is certainly rising in Australia. So thank you.
Mel, when the lights went out, I thought there must have been a party there or something. Mel has kindly agreed to answer any questions that you might have.
I think, thank you for that. I think freedom of speech is very important, but I also think that editors have to take their job seriously, in the sense that if there's 0.2% of scientists saying this is a load of rubbish, that's how many articles should be published, not 50%.
Absolutely agree with you. If 0.2% of scientists are saying that this is not happening, then that's what should be reflected in the newspapers. For most of the first 20 years that I was working in this arena, it was always a balance. There was always another side. oh, we have to actually report both sides of the story. And it's like, but there isn't another side. And until I realised what was going on, I couldn't understand. Like, I was as perplexed as other climate scientists of like, why is there another side? And this is the other side.
Is the ice in the Antarctic disappearing at a similar rate, or what's the story there?
It's not a similar rate, but I will handball that to Ian Allison, who's a specialist in sea ice. Give him a quick update on Antarctic sea ice.
Yeah, Antarctic sea ice is quite different from the Arctic. The Arctic is contained within the continental ring of Asia. In the Antarctic, it's all open to the sea, to the open ocean. Antarctic sea ice, we know very little about the thickness of it. And the extent is partly controlled by the ocean currents and the winds, where the ice is pushed by wind and currents. And as long as, its extent may be controlled by that, but that doesn't mean the mass is great. It may be getting thinner. And so for a long time it looked as though Antarctic sea ice was increasing in extent, but we didn't know anything about the mass. But just in the last 3 or 4 years, it suddenly swung around and started decreasing at a very rapid rate, similar to what's happening in the Arctic.
Well, I like a lot of your analysis. I agree with almost all of it. But are you really suggesting that I should ignore all the requests I get to fact check? Should I ignore the requests I get to fact check?
Oh no, not if you're an expert in this. That's one thing we do need, but we also need everybody else telling the story of climate science. So no, I think you should keep fact checking, John. Definitely.
Justin?
Mel, that was really enlightening. And my question is sort of what measures you and your colleagues are taking to actually reach the people who make the decisions in government at all levels, local, state, federal.
I know when I worked in the United States that we would meet with people in Congress, we would meet with state legislators. But what's, I think, more important is to meet with local people. So there's a lot of work being done with local councils in Australia. So that's where a lot of things get done. So you can almost ignore the international level. I think we've lost that. Sometimes you can ignore the national level, and we're doing things in local councils in Australia that are addressing climate change. So I'm on the Hobart Portfolio Committee for Climate Change, and we've just recently helped the council publish a climate strategy. So they're working on waste management to decrease emissions. They're working on car fleet. They're working on public transport and different forms of transport. So those on the ground things, I think, are much more accessible, certainly to people who want to see change, than it is working at the international or national level.
It confounds me all the time how the naysayers and the disinformation sort of get the message across when things like the summary for policymakers from IPCC is signed off by governments. It's really quite mild compared to some of the findings in the full report, but each of those summary for policymakers is signed off by every government who's signed up to UNFCCC.
That's right, Ian. The summary for policymakers is signed off. However, that's the document that gets edited. So every country edits it, and you know how they've been watered down. So from 1990 through to 2022, every single IPCC summary gets watered down. Imagine if they hadn't been right from the beginning. I don't know, I don't understand either how you can ignore that summary for policymakers. But they have demonised the IPCC. So the IPCC gets attacked all the time.
They are watered down, but they get stronger each cycle.
They do get stronger each cycle. It's true. And I have been asked about the reticence of scientists. You know, scientists are conservative. We kind of go out there and go, oh, we think this is right, but we need to go back and do a few more calculations. Whereas an economist, a politician, they'll just get up and say something, whether it's true or not. And that's just not what scientists are taught to do. So we're also a little bit complicit in being, I think, too careful. At least we were in the beginning. I don't think that's true now.
Mel, my name's Scott Bell. I'm a fifth generation Tasmanian. I graduated from this university, and in a previous life I was a GP. And I retired in 2006. And during my professional life I worked in a variety of states, and I was never once called before a medical board to explain myself or my practice or my ethics and my morals. Since I retired, and you started your presentation with a poem that asked what I can do, and you finished your presentation with the same question, and I haven't heard any questions which have addressed that particular challenge. So maybe I can tell you what I do. Since I retired, I've become more involved with environmental and conservation issues, and I work with a climate activist group, a global climate activist group called Extinction Rebellion. We've got a strong presence in Launceston, and I've gone through all the usual routines of writing letters to newspapers and writing letters to politicians and doing all the usual sort of stuff, which, you know, gets an off-pat response and might raise a few questions and perhaps raises a bit of curiosity for people, but it doesn't address the fundamental issues. So this coming Thursday, I'll be arrested for the 20th time because I'm putting my neck on the block with a few other activists in Launceston, and we try and educate the community and the financial institutions and the politicians and the general public by doing our non-violent direct action activism. So there's quite a few people here who probably lead fairly safe lives, and I can tell you, getting arrested and raising your head above the parapet and standing up for your morals and ethics is not all that difficult. It's not all that scary, and it helps to address some of these issues that you've raised. What can I do? Because writing letters and meeting politicians, excuse the phrase, like pissing them in really. So there are other things we can do, and I just wanted to address the things that I do, because I've got kids, I've got grandkids, and I'm already injecting into my great-grandkids just like this you've raised.
Thank you, Scott.
So I just throw the challenge out to other people to think a little bit outside the square and have a bit of fun doing it. And look, I've accumulated lots of convictions, lots of bail conditions, I've got thousands of dollars in fines, but I haven't been put in jail, and my professional reputation, which is not necessary to defend anymore because I'm not a registered medical practitioner, doesn't really matter. But my moral and my ethical reputation is something I'm proud of.
Thank you, Scott, for your contribution.
And thank you, Mel, I think, for your clarity, your focus and the depth of your examination. I think you've helped us to understand what climate scientists are up against and the level of deceit and the power of the social media. I think this should provoke us, as Scott has suggested, into some greater efforts so that we don't wake up early in the morning worried that we haven't done enough for our grandchildren. Would you please join me in thanking them?